It's just like Christmas. I think I'm going to start by installing the valve cover. That way we lessen the risk of things dropping down inside the engine as we work. Then I'm going to reinstall the things that I need in order to lift this up out of here and put it on the engine hoist. I'm going to complete my assembly on the engine hoist. All right, as I said, I'm going to start with the valve cover. Make sure that this mating surface is nice and clean. Goes on like this, if I'm not mistaken. Yep, that is correct. One thing missing, my gasket and the bolt that I just dropped. I'm gonna lay these bolts out so that I can put them back in the same order, in much the same way as I did when I took it to the parts washer. I can flip it over, install my gasket, and get this on here. All right, we have our gasket in place. Notice no sealant. Let the gasket do its work. I'll be honest, the only two that were really of any concern were this one with the bracket over here and this one that actually has a stud sticking up over here. Those are the only two I think you really need to be concerned about. I'm going to start in the center and work my way around in a spiral pattern out to the edges. Same way I would do a head gasket. Now I've got them all snug, I'm just going to run them down the rest of the way. First piece of our old engine on our new engine. Let's put that plate on the front, install that stud in the back here so we can get this up on the hoist and it'll be easier to work on. Then we can actually take our old engine, deposit it into here. I'll find some way to hook it up to the engine hoist and drop it in here because the old engine actually has a core in it. So we return the old engine for some money back on our original purchase price of the engine. Okay, here we have that rear bracket that is attached by just this nut on this stud back here. Now we cruise around to the front of the engine. I don't know if you recall, but we had two studs that need to go into here. And we did that with our double nut method. Now I know these nuts go onto these studs, so I'm just going to thread them on there finger tight so that they're there when I need them. Now I'll just take our, well, I don't know what you want to call this, sort of an idler pulley slash brace assembly, whatever. Now I want to run this down with my impact, but I want to try to do what I can to protect any debris or anything from falling down into this timing cover area. I'm just going to slip that plastic up under there to accomplish that. Now that this is installed, we'll be able to reinstall our chain, lift this out of here, and complete our assembly at a much more friendly height. Now as I put this back up onto the hoist, I'm going to put it back on to where the front is facing the hoist. That way I can just leave it on here when I drop it back into the truck. I might have to reposition that after a little bit because I can't quite get the hoist far enough onto this little plastic tub that this thing was shipped in. I've lifted it up as high as it'll go to start with because what I think I'll do is I think I'm going to start down underneath and install the oil pump and the oil pan and pretty much do what I can to seal up as much of the engine as possible. So that this way as I work, I don't contaminate it with any junk that might fall in there. So I figure if I'll be safe, if everything is sealed up while I work, that way I lessen the risk of getting things in places I don't want them to go. I guess I'll start by moving my tub out of the way, and then take our oil pan to catch anything that drips. I don't want to install my oil pump dry. So what I'll do is I'm going to pour a little bit of oil down in the supply hole. So this is where the oil comes out after it's gone through the pump. And I'm going to fill it all the way up. Now it's probably going to start running out the pickup. That's why I have the pan underneath here. But I'm going to do this so that this thing doesn't go in dry. So it's filled up with some oil. Now I'll install that up on the engine, and this way it's at least got some oil in the pump to start with. It should also have grease in there. It should be packed with some grease, and I'm pretty sure they did that. And we're also going to prime the engine when we first start it up. But that's one of the things we're doing here. We're trying to do our best to give the engine the best chance possible when we first start it up. This isn't like a salvage yard engine. This is like a brand new engine. We have to make sure that it doesn't fire up dry, because if it does, well, we got problems. There's no gasket, no RTV, nothing that goes between these two. Some of you may disagree with my methods here, but I am going to run this down with a 3/8 impact. Oil pump is now installed. Just want to make sure that this moves freely. This is the drive, this is the thing that spins it. It's run off the cam, and this is the back side of the camshaft here. So we want to make sure that, you know, when we install this drive here that connects to the cam, you can look down in here and see that that shaft is ready to be connected to its drive, and it's driven off the camshaft that connects to this idler that we're going to put in here that drives the oil pump. We need to make sure that that's able to spin freely so it can push oil up through the engine. This ridge is where this rubber seal is going to sit. Now these ends go up into slots on either side of this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to install this before I install the oil pan. I'm going to slip it up in here and let it sit. There's going to be no sealer or anything on the inside of this. I'm just going to install it just as you see it. And then I'll install the oil pan, but I'm going to take the provided silicone and I'm going to goop up the corners where the two gaskets are going to meet. I don't believe this has a specific direction that it needs to be installed in. It just needs to stay in place long enough for us to get our oil pan in place, which will hold it the rest of the way. All right, I'm going to cut the corner on this, and I'm going to add silicone to each of these corners so that as I install the gasket, it's going to seal it up. Okay, I've removed all but one of my little clamps that I know is not going to make contact with anything in the front because the timing cover is not in place yet. But I also have two oil pan fasteners that I have ready to go that I'm going to install. In addition to that, I have a 10 millimeter on the end of a driver tool that I can use to run these down. And then my gasket is still held in place by the gasket adhesive. Once you get like the first two in, you're kind of home free. I like to leave everything loose until I get them all started. That way I know that I've gone through the gasket, because you can see it if it's hanging down just a little bit, if it's going through the gasket properly. And then all the fasteners are threading in nicely and not cross-threading. All right, now we have the gasket. This gasket's still in place. I want to make sure that it doesn't slide into there too badly because we're going to have to get our timing cover into here to line up. But the rest of everything is all lined up. Our gasket's in place. We've got our sealant that's kind of gooping out a little bit, which is okay, because we really want it to seal that area in here. And then we're just gonna run these down. If I remember correctly, the studs were up in the front. Now I'm gonna snug them all up in a crisscross pattern. I'm gonna wait until I have my timing cover installed before I commit to this the rest of the way and to fully tighten these down. This way I'm sure that, you know, my front gasket and everything is sealed up like it's supposed to be, and I'm happy with the result. So let's go get that front timing cover, clean that thing up, get a gasket installed, and get that on here. Here's our timing cover. This is the old front seal, and we're going to replace it. The new gasket kit came with a new seal, and I just pretty much fitted it in place, and it looks like it's going to be the same. But we're faced with the task of getting the old one out of here. One of the ways we can do that is we can come in from the back side and actually knock it out with a drift punch. And then we can clean this cover all up and get rid of the old gasket material and everything, and get it ready to install back on the engine. There we go. Now let's clean this bad boy up. I'm pretty happy with that result. This stuff in here, I'm not that concerned about. I think it'll be fine. We'll just dry it off with a little bit of compressed air. Our part is clean and ready to accept its new front seal. To install the seal, I'm just going to use a rubber mallet and tap around the outside. This can be a pain in the butt, but the important takeaway here is that you get it in evenly, and also that you install it correctly. The ridge side goes towards the inside. Now that the seal has been installed, I'm going to take a little bit of grease and I'm going to go along the inside of it so that the seal, when I first started up, is not dry. If you'll notice, there's an oil return back here, so as this scrapes oil off the back of this, it goes back down into the oil pan. But we don't want to install our seals dry because they'll heat up and it'll possibly damage them. You don't need a lot of grease, just a little bit, so that things slide nicely in there. In addition to that seal, we also have the seal that goes in the back for the timing cover. Looks like it goes in like this. It's just a neoprene or rubber seal. I'm not really sure which. I think it's neoprene. Just sort of pops into place. Now, our part is ready to install on our new engine. There are a couple of areas of concern here when it comes to sealing, and that is where this rubber meets the gasket on both sides. I'm going to put a little bit of the provided silicone sealant in those areas. I'm also a little worried about these corners. Therefore, I'm also going to put a little bit on these corners. It's transitions where leaks happen, it seems. I'm not going to go crazy here. I just want to put a little bit on the corners there. I'm going to put a little bit on the corners under the gasket. And lastly, where the gasket meets the engine block here, I'm also going to put some in that area. You don't need to go overboard here. And the reason is because once everything's compressed, the space is a lot less. So just a little bit kind of goes a long way. I'm thinking I might have made a mistake by installing the oil pan first. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to loosen all the oil pan bolts so I can drop this down so I can get this timing cover on. I really should have put the timing cover on before I installed the oil pan. That was kind of a screw up on my part, if I'm honest. I'm gonna go so far as to take these front two all the way out. This is actually working. I'm going to keep an eye on the gasket, and I'm also going to make sure that I install it onto the dowels. I think we'll be okay. These were all the same size. Now I'm going to install and tighten down the timing cover first before I do the oil pan. Some of you might say, I want to know a specific torque for this. I don't know the specific torque for this, but I'm using a 1/4" ratchet and it doesn't have a long reach on it, which means I'm not putting as much torque on it when I twist it. I'm kind of winging it and playing by ear. I've got a lot of experience putting together things like this, and the smaller fasteners don't require a whole lot of torque, so I find 1/4" works best. I just run it down, it's snug, I'm done. If you want to know a specific torque, check the service manual, but I honestly don't know. We've got 2 nuts now that go on the studs that came with the timing cover. And just like before with this oil pan, I'm going to tighten it in a crisscross pattern from underneath and from the center outwards. Now I'll tighten everything down for real. That's it. All right, something you kind of want to be hyper aware of is as the gasket is crushing in here, you'll notice that it's starting to come out. Once it starts to move, stop. Because, like I said, this is lubricant, it causes it to move out. So you don't want it to run these up so tight that you actually split this gasket. So once it starts to move, stop.
On our old block, we have a couple of loose fasteners. One up here, one down here. There's more than just that, but I'm going to start with these and transfer these over to the new block.
As long as we're over here, remember a little guy for the oil filter? I'm going to take a little bit of Loctite and put it on these threads, because once again, I don't want this to come out when I change the oil one time. So I'm just going to put a little bit of Loctite on these threads so that after I install this, it stays in place. While we're here, let's install our new oil filter, but we're going to do 2 things to it. One, we're going to lubricate the seal with some new engine oil. 2, we're going to fill it up with engine oil before we install it. This will help prime the engine when we go to start this guy up. So our filter will be relatively full of oil when we start it up for the first time. This is a good practice whenever you do an oil change, actually. Before you install your new filter, just fill it up with a little bit of new oil before you install the filter, and you won't have to start it up dry. Got my oil pan under here to catch anything that runs out. Now we have this gear that drives our oil pump. There's an O-ring up here that I want to see if I have in my kit. And I hope I do, because I just may ruin it by taking it off of here to find out if I have one. No easy task, but now that it's off, we can match it up with what we have in the kit. I think I found a good match. They're both about the same thickness and about the same circumference. So those two things mean that I believe this seal is probably going to work. Once again, we don't want to install our seals dry. Take some grease around the outside of the seal. A lot of times I use silicone, but in a case like this, these seals are meant to keep back petroleum products. So they're meant to handle oil, so they shouldn't disintegrate when oil is put onto them. Now this, we have to make sure it comes into contact with our oil pump drive and sits in there right. There we go. 10 millimeter. Now I know this has made contact with the cam and the oil pump drive. You could just sort of feel it slide home. Unfortunately, I could not find new seals for the cam and crank sensors. So I'm just gonna put a little grease on, install my cam sensor, a little bit of grease on my crank sensor. Some might argue that it's a good time to replace these and just put new ones in, because they do fail on occasion. I'm going to hope for the best here. Got 8 millimeter for the cam sensor and 10 millimeter for the crank sensor. Install the knock sensor. Now there's nothing really behind this. This is just screwing into the block, so you don't have to like kill it. You don't have to put any sealer on it or anything. You just have to make sure it's secure. On the old engine block, where this plug is where the oil pressure sending unit screwed into. So I'm going to have to remove that plug in order to install this oil pressure sending unit. I'm going to put a little bit of thread tape on the sending unit. Remember, I cleaned up the threads, so I always forget. But I believe I'm going to go opposite. Yeah, every time I install thread tape, I have this debate with myself. A couple of people told me the last time I asked. Of course, I immediately forgot. I think that's the right way. I think that way it won't bunch up. Thread tape is not a sealant. Thread tape actually makes it so you can get a couple more turns out of something. So don't be thinking you're sealing, you're actually making it so you can turn it so that it can actually friction weld itself into place and create a seal. It's weird, I know, but it's a little known fact. This guy was 27 millimeter, or I also believe an 1/16". The knock sensor was 22, I believe. I believe that's secure. And that's all we want. We just want it secure and in there. We don't want it so tight we're going to break it or damage it in some way. Now that we've got the sensors pretty well bolted in, I am going to install the coil packs. I kept all the fasteners where they went so that it would be easier to install now. These are 13 millimeter. This evap solenoid installs under this stud. It is also a 13 millimeter. And let's get our engine mount in these three holes here. These are 15s, and then I believe this bottom one is that 15/16 that we had to mess with before. I think that about does it for this. this side here, with the exception of the intake manifold. Here we have our intake manifold. We do have a new intake gasket, but not a new throttle body gasket. I'm gonna leave the throttle body gasket alone. I'm not overly concerned about it, but I will replace the intake gasket because considering what we have to go through when this thing is back in the truck, let's just replace it now. One other thing I thought of while I'm here is to kind of do like a poor man's fuel injector cleaning. So I'm just gonna hit the back side of these injectors with a little bit of throttle cleaner while I'm here. And our new engine will have nice clean fuel delivery. Install the new one, which is this lovely blue color. Nice new gasket for our nice new cylinder head. We're going to be all sealed up and awesome. All right, we left this here to remind us that we needed something here. So I can take that off now. Slide this guy right in here. Got another nut that goes down under this stud. I believe the rest are just 13mm bolts that thread into the cylinder head. I don't recall any other brackets or anything that need to be in there. But we need to make sure that we're free of obstruction between these two. But I don't think that's an issue. We also need to be aware that we don't want our gasket to slip and fall and get into a different position. These are all the same length. It doesn't really matter what order or how you install them here. Start in the middle, work our way out. This is plastic. It doesn't need a lot of torque. Plus it's just a rubber gasket, so it's going to seal, you know, a little bit easier than, say, one that was not that way. If memory serves, this bracket held a harness just like that. I'm going to say that intake manifold is installed. Remember our little fuel injector harness just sort of went into that little clamp there. Check it out. It's a whole new side of the engine. I think I'll install the this bracket here for the hoses. I had a new gasket in my kit. Just going to install the gasket as you see it. I got everything cleaned up and prepped from before. So all I should need to do is install it. Given that my bolts were old and rusty, put a little bit of oil on the threads, make them go in a little easier. Our gasket kit came with a new gasket, exhaust manifold gasket. Unfortunately, it is not of the same type that came off. This means that I am going to be reusing the steel gasket that was on the old engine. Some of you might have an issue with this. I don't. Steel gaskets, I've reused those tons and tons of times. I don't have a problem reusing steel gaskets. If it was a graphite gasket like this that might have come apart or something, which I believe I mentioned before about these gaskets, in case we didn't have them, I'm going to reuse them. And now I'm glad I did, because now I'll be able to put those parts back in and they shouldn't leak. The reason why these gaskets are different is because this engine comes with an air system, an AIR system, which basically takes air and injects it into the exhaust to help meet emission standards. It helps burn off extra hydrocarbons. You give it a little more air, those things ignite, everything's fine. So if we were to use this gasket, we'd negate the use of that system. So we really are forced into reusing our old gasket. That's my story, I'm sticking to it. Looks like it goes on like that. Yeah, definitely goes on like this. All of these exhaust studs I've hit with a little bit of oil to help them install more easily. I have one oddball. I don't know where it goes. Slightly larger than the rest of them. Let's get these installed and see what happens. These are all 13s. And now our AIR tube will be installed. We got one nut that goes down here. 2 10s, one in each stud. Now, as I said before, when I took this apart, if there is a leak here, not a big deal. It's not that difficult to get to. There is a fastener that transferred over from the old block that I'm just going to thread in here that I know I'll need later. I'm more than a little disappointed that the gasket kit did not come with a new seal for the dipstick tube here. It would have been nice. It just slides in there and then hooks onto the stud. At the moment, I'm not finding the nut to secure this. I'm not going to worry about it right now. It may be over at the truck. I can't remember whether I took this out in order to make it easier to get the engine out of the vehicle. It's entirely possible. So I'm just going to leave that be for now and I'm going to move on to the water pump. I've already put gasket adhesive in the gasket on my new water pump so that it stays in place. And it's merely a matter of, well, I guess figuring out which way it goes on and fastening it down. Yay, I think I got it. It's the 13s. Install our pulley. To make things easier, I'm going to use an impact. If you don't have one, you can tighten these up each one by one and use this screwdriver to hold the pulley in place while you tighten stuff. I'm going to temporarily install the spark plugs, and I say temporarily because I'm going to take them out and crank the engine before I start it up, and that way I can work all the engine oil through the engine. But for now, it's probably not a bad idea to install these just to keep anything from falling down inside the engine as we work. So I'll just thread them down in. A little oil on the threads, just bottom them out, but I'm not going to tighten. This is a brand new set of spark plugs. A little bit of oil on the threads before I'm putting them down in there. As long as we're of the mind to renew our ignition system, I'm going to replace these wires also. I don't know if you remember from before, the ends of these wires were a little jacked up, so it's probably a good idea to replace them. I have a new set of wires here. This old set of wires is nicely numbered. My new set of wires, however, is not, and I'm not going to connect the ignition wires just yet because, remember, I'm going to take the spark plugs out anyway, so there's really no point. So what I'll do for now is I'll peel off this outer covering, remove this other bracket, or wire loom. Let's call it a wire loom. Remove that. Looks like my longest one is going to be number 4. That makes sense since it's all the way at the back of the engine. So I will try to find my longest wire here, which would be this one. Seems to hang down farther than the rest. You can install a little bit of silicone on here or what have you to help give you a better advantage here. It's not gonna hurt you. Number 1 looks like it's probably the shortest of the bunch. It has the shortest distance to travel. So looking at my set, I've got this one here. Now the interesting thing about this ignition system is that you can kind of screw up 1 and 4 because they both fire at the same time. So in a way, you kind of got a 50-50 chance of getting it right no matter what. We'll get into these type of ignition systems at some point, but for now, just know that these two and these two both fire at the same time. I'm going to say I'm going to need number 3 to be longer than number 2. So this is number 3. We'll look at the longest of the 2 that I have left, and that would be this one. It's also a lot easier to install this wire set now while it's out of the truck, because as you can see, it's not the easiest engine to change wires on. Well, these are kind of tight, but looks like it'll work. We'll group them up with our wire loom. I'll just test them out, and then I'm going to label them all. Put them in our handy covering. This will help protect them from any heat that they might encounter in their lifetime. I'm going to clamp it down towards this end. Well, wasn't it clamped on this end? I think I'll do it on this end. You know, now that I'm thinking about it, probably should have labeled them before I put this on here. First, I'm going to put pieces of tape on all of them. All right, now what I can do is just sort of wiggle and pull on one of these. Okay, this one goes to number 2. Okay, there it is. This would be number 3. So really I could kind of stop here, but I'm not. And this one's number 4, which makes my last one left over number 1. All this time I've kind of forgotten about the back of the engine. Let's get to that now. Remember our little plate on the back of the cylinder head, which I suspected was part of an EGR system? Got a new gasket for it. 8 millimeters, nail them down. Let's get that flywheel back on there. You see this hole right here? There's also one on the flywheel. Line those 2 holes up. Many times these are offset in such a way because this is a balanced assembly, and this helps balance the crankshaft. So you want to make sure that it's on there correctly. So they usually, like I said, offset this so that this can only go on one way. Make sure it's all the way in before you let loose on it. I've underestimated in the past and cut my hand pretty good on a flywheel before because I didn't do exactly that. Memory serves, these were a strange size. Yeah, they were like almost a 17. I'll make darn sure they're all going in right before I hit them with the impact. Is there a torque for these? Yes. Do I know it? No. Do I think it's necessary? Good question, but I'm going to go with, I'm just going to hit it with my impact. I was going to put the clutch on now, but I'm not. And some of you will know why. That's because this opening is not the same size as the opening in the old crankshaft. Let me show you. See that? That is a pilot bushing.
And that is because we have a manual transmission. So we're going to need to get one of those and install it in our crankshaft before we install the clutch, because it's going to be really difficult with the clutch installed. So we'll need to install that before we put the engine back in. And what this does is it supports the input shaft of the transmission. If we did not install this, the input shaft would not be supported, and we could mess up our transmission, possibly the input shaft bearing or something like that. So we really need to get one of these pilot bushings and install it into our new engine before we install it in the vehicle.
Since I'm at something of a standstill, I'm going to install some of these things on the front of the engine that weren't there when I removed it. And one of those things would be, it's a two-piece crank pulley assembly, but I'm going to get that on there. And what I've done, I should show you this. What I've done before I've installed it is I've gone over it with a wire wheel and cleaned off all the gook that was on here. And I've added just a very thin coat of grease so that when it goes past the seal, it goes past nice and smooth. Taking a little bit of oil and put it on the threads of the crank bolt. If I can catch a few threads, I might just run it in. And I can. This is an 18 millimeter, and looks like we're gonna have to take it back off and then put it back on. So we'll run this in, take the bolt back out, and then put this on. But we'll use this to draw the front of this in. Hopefully my 3/8 will be able to do it. If not, I'll have to get out the 1/2 inch. I'm gonna go grab the 1/2 inch. Okay, I've got the 1/2 inch ready, but what I did was I knocked this loose first. And I'm just gonna take a little bit of oil and put it underneath this outside washer here on this bolt. This way, this can slide up against the washer a little bit easier. The compressor may kick on. If that happens, I'm just gonna keep going and you'll know why it's loud. Looks like we're in. In order to put the outer part of the pulley on, we need to first take off the bolt. And I think it's safe to put this on now because I don't think it's going to interfere with anything. And there are 3 fasteners that hold the pulley in place. I don't believe there's any timing marks on here or anything to be concerned about, so you can just go ahead and fire away. Make sure I've got all those started. We'll run this back down. These are 15s. I could also install this pulley, but I mocked it up a minute ago and it kind of interferes with what's going on here. So I'm just going to leave this off for now. It's not going to be that difficult to install. The tensioner, I don't know if that's going to get in the way of something, so I'm going to leave that off. This, I knew I was going to have to do, so we'll just leave that. Based on past experience, and I'm not saying I need to worry about this with a rebuild, I found it's a good idea to rotate the engine just to see if it spins before you put it in the vehicle. I should actually take the plugs out and put a little bit of oil in there and spin it over, but it's spinning over fine. It all sounds good. Feels good too. Can't wait to fire this thing up and see how it sounds.